This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is we've got a great interview for you today with General Frank McKenzie, who was the combatant commander of U.S. Central Command. And he's the guy who carried out the strike that killed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He's the guy who carried out the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. Presided over one of the strongest periods of U.S. taking out bad guys and deterring their sponsors in the Middle East. And he's going to take us deep into those stories about how those happened. He's got a new book out where he tells these stories, and he's a great storyteller, and he's going to take you behind the scenes in some of these operations, and it's absolutely fascinating.
It is absolutely fascinating. And, you know, it's funny. Over the last 40 years that I've been in this business, I've met a lot of combatant commanders. We called them sinks in the old days.
Rumsfeld changed that. I was there. He said he was commander-in-chief of U.S. Central Command and like that, and Rumsfeld came in and said there's only one commander-in-chief.
Yes. Well, if only Rumsfeld had kept himself to the bureaucratic exercises that engaged him. But anyway, yeah, not a fan, as you know.
I am.
Not a fan. Not a fan. Sorry. Anyway, but one of the things that I've seen over these years is that these guys that are immersed in the region become very much part of the region, and something that has changed that was hugely important was that Israel, which used to be part of EUCOM, the European Command, because the Arabs would not consort with Israel within CENTCOM. Israel was taken out of EUCOM and put in CENTCOM, and I think that has been transformative, not simply for the Arabs who get to meet with the Israelis who get to meet with the Arabs, but for the leadership of the combatant command that actually gets to meet with all sides. It really gives them different perspectives, and I've seen the change, and it's been amazing.
Well, one of the things, we don't get into this into our discussion, but one of the, I don't want to relitigate the Iraq War here, but the elimination of Saddam Hussein is the reason why you've seen you wouldn't have had the Abraham Accords without that, because he was the check on Iran for a lot of these countries. And when he was eliminated, the only regional power that is able to provide a check on Iran that they can partner with is Israel. So bringing them under central command and the elimination of Saddam Hussein has fostered a completely different set of circumstances in the region when it comes to security cooperation.
And, you're exactly right. And when we'll let everybody, our guests, judge for themselves. But one thing that's absolutely clear is that he has a real grasp of the push and pull inside the region in a way that I think some of our previous commanders have not had. And it is just hugely important to actually be able to judge your enemy. When I listened the other day, Mark, to the Biden administration, I'm not allowed to say who, but a senior official talk about Lebanon and Hezbollah, and he didn't know what he was talking about. We need to build up the Lebanese government so that they feel their institutions are strong enough to stand up to Hezbollah. And I was just like, they are Hezbollah. What are you talking about? It was the most naive, and there's no wonder that the U.S. efforts on the ground inside Lebanon have been completely fruitless. But, it really is striking that our military commanders are much more acute in their political assessment of the bad guys than our political leaders are.
Because they have to deal with them
right.
in a way that our political leaders don't. But here's an interesting thing. So General McKenzie stays completely out of politics in this
Very capably,
interview, but we don't have to. And overlaid among his discussion is a political narrative, because he starts out by describing the job of the combatant commander and how the combatant commander answers to the Secretary of Defense, who answers to the President of the United States. That's the chain of command. There's nobody else involved in that chain of command. He served under two different commanders-in-chief, And the stories he tells tell a very different story of that kind of presidential leadership. So he describes how when he came in, the ISIS caliphate had been basically removed to almost nothing. He describes a very bold decision to take out Baghdadi, which was a high-risk operation as opposed to doing it through drones like the previous administration had done everything, and why that was important. He describes the operation to take out Qasem Soleimani and how these established deterrence. And then he contrasts that with today, with the situation we have with the Houthis who are firing on us, and there doesn't seem to be the will. We have the capability to stop that, but we don't seem to have the political will. All those decisions were made under President Trump, who really established deterrence in the region. And that deterrence has atrophied as the Iranians have assessed that our fear of escalation has dissipated under the current administration. I think the previous administration, the view was you make your enemies fear escalation. You make your enemies worried about escalation. And if you're so fearful of escalation, it leads to more escalation. So as our friend Fred Kagan always describes, we're being governed now by PhDs in escalation studies. And, Donald Trump didn't have a PhD, but he certainly understood escalation a lot better than these guys do.
Okay, so you are right. I want to make two observations about that. The first is that I think, generally speaking, the inclination of Republican administrations toward the military is more deferential. And that's not a Civ Mill complaint. That's not that Republicans don't understand the role of civil-military relations. It is that they respect their input because they know these are the guys who have to defend us, these are the guys who know the terrain, and these are the guys who know the cost of war as well. So they're very deferential to them. And I would say, when you talk about the military, the people who want to go to war least of all, ever, are military leaders because they do know the cost, right? So they're always game for a diplomatic solution, for a political solution, for an economic solution before they are encouraging a military solution. But when they do, their voices matter. Inside Democratic administrations, that is much less the case. And that was the case under Bill Clinton. That was the case under Barack Obama for sure. And it was the case under Joe Biden. So that's a general observation. And it is absolutely an intellectualized sense that people with PhDs are superior to people with 4 stars. That's just a thing. It's a sad.
I don't think the decision to take out Soleimani was a deference to the military's advice.
No, it was a very bold decision. But wait,
it was a very bold
decision.
decision. And we also know, for example, that also Trump we didn't get into this with General McKenzie, but Trump also bombed Syria twice in response to the use of chemical weapons. And it has been reported that the military was so worried about it that they actually held back some options from him because they thought he was going to go too far. So this was coming from the commander-in-chief, these decisions, and the willingness to do the higher risk option to not drone Baghdadi, but to actually go in there and take him out with U.S. boots on the ground was a very bold and risky decision. Tell me I'm wrong.
Yes, but Mark, one of the most consequential attacks that took place by Iran on a target in the Gulf happened during the Trump administration, and Donald Trump didn't do anything about it. Didn't do
Which one?
Anything about it. The Abqaiq attack on the Saudi refinery, which
Yep.
there was another attack around that same time, also from Iranian proxies, killing 2 civilians on the ground in the United Arab Emirates. Again,
Yep.
both of those countries had put their hands on the orb with the good old DJT, and he didn't do anything. So yes, great on Soleimani. I agree with you. Great on Baghdadi. Great. But he wasn't uniformly great by any standard.
Well, no president is uniformly great,
Right.
but I think he deserves credit for those decisions.
Well, he's getting it.
For all 3 of those decisions, to take off the gloves and take out the ISIS caliphate, to take out Baghdadi, and to take out Soleimani. These were 3 of the most consequential decisions in the Middle East in a very long time, and he did it, and he did the right thing. And taking out Soleimani was probably one of the most consequential decisions any president has made in Middle East policy in a long, long time.
Oh, well, let's give equal credit, please, to Barack Obama for taking out Osama bin Laden. And let's remember who didn't want to do it.
Well, yeah, Joe Biden.
Bingo.
Joe Biden didn't want to do it.
That's right. So on that note.
Just one caveat, which is that there is no controversy over taking out bin Laden. I mean, any president who got him in his sights would have taken him out. The decision to take out Soleimani was not a no-brainer like that. And the fact that
But
Joe
Baghdadi
Biden
was.
and the fact that Joe Biden couldn't make the right decision on that no-brainer tells you everything you need to know about Joe Biden.
Well, I think the American people have figured that one out. Anyway, let's get to our interview. General Frank McKenzie is the former commander of the United States Central Command. He currently serves as the executive director of the University of South Florida's Global National Security Institute. He's the executive director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, and he is a distinguished senior fellow on national security at the Middle East Institute. He's also the author of the book that he talks about, which is really, I commend to everybody. It came out just a couple months ago, and it is a page turner. It's called Melting Point, The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century.
Here's our interview. General McKenzie, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be on with you today.
Great to have you. So you have a new book out called The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. Tell us why you wrote the book and what the message is that you're trying to get across.
Mark, so the title of the book is actually taken from Barbara Tuchman's great book about the beginning of the First World War, The Guns of August, a book that's still in print today and probably still has lessons and is relevant today. And in the book, she uses a phrase called that melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander. And that always stuck with me as I've gone back and reread that book many times. I was a combatant commander for 3 years, from 2019 to 2022. And under the U.S. system, a combatant commander is unique. There are 11 combatant commanders, 7 are geographic combatant commanders, people that own a part of the earth, and 4 are functional combatant commanders. I was a geographic combatant commander responsible for U.S. military activity in that region of the world between Egypt in the west, Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, and Yemen in the south. But more significantly, as a combatant commander, you work for 2 people in the world. You work for the President of the United States, and you work for the Secretary of Defense. They're the only 2 people that can give you orders, and you are in the chain of command. So, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the senior military officer of the United States by custom, law, and tradition. He's the senior military advisor to the President and the Secretary of Defense, but he is not in the chain of command. He cannot cause an airplane to fly, a ship to sail, a bomb to drop, a missile to be fired. Only combatant commanders have that authority, derived from orders issued by the President of the United States. That places you in a unique position because not only are you in the chain of command to give these orders, but typically as a combatant commander, you're in a position to give policy advice. You are a junior partner in that dialogue. And that's the way it should be, because ultimately civilian leadership needs to make decisions in this country. It's the only way that we can go forward as a republic. But nonetheless, the combatant commander is in a unique position because you give advice. Sometimes the advice is taken, sometimes it isn't. And then you execute the actual outcome of that advice, the presidential decision that directs the forces of the United States to undertake or not to undertake certain activities. So it's a unique perspective. And as I finished my time at Central Command, I wanted to write about it. I'd been present for some pretty significant events, and I thought it was worth talking a little bit about those. And so I did, and that's the reason I wrote the book.
Okay, I've read this book, and I have to say, without making an invidious comment about other authors who come from a similar background to you, and there are a few who are wonderful writers. I love H.R. McMaster's work, but I think you stand out as an extraordinarily good storyteller, which is a gift. Tell us a couple of the great stories that you tell in the book.
Sure. So I would start with the decision to strike Baghdadi, who was the leader of ISIS. By the spring of 2019, when I assumed command of CENTCOM, the physical caliphate, that state that he and other members of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS as we know them in shorthand, had founded, that was sort of centered on the Euphrates River, that had expanded well into Iraq and dominated a big chunk of Syria, that had been compressed down to nothing by the actions of my predecessor, a great Army general named Joe Votel. And down the southern Euphrates River, just to the west of the border with Iraq, we finished the caliphate off. They no longer held ground. Well, Baghdadi was the leader of the caliphate. Some of you may recall that he pronounced the caliphate, and a lot of TV coverage. He was involved in the murder of a lot of people, including probably some U.S. citizens. But he wasn't a guy that actually was in it till the end. He fled before we finished the fight down there, and he went out to live somewhere in western Syria. And he took with him, when he went, a couple of wives, a couple of security guys, and 14 children. And the children were there for two reasons. First of all, as sexual slaves, but more importantly, because he knew it would make us hard to get him if he was always surrounded by children. So we went out there to live in a mud-walled compound a couple of miles from the Turkish border, right in the middle of nowhere in some really desolate, ugly country in western Syria. He was on the top of our list of people that we wanted to capture or kill. And so the summer of 2019, we spent a lot of time looking for him. By we, I mean the Department of Defense, and I also mean our partners up the river, the Central Intelligence Agency, and other elements of the intelligence community. By the early fall of 2019, we had tracked him down to this location, and we were pretty sure he was there. We were pretty sure that he didn't leave except under unpredictable circumstances that made it very hard to find him out in the open somewhere, and that whenever he appeared either for prayers, exposed himself, there were children all around him. And we also knew that he wore an explosive vest or professed to wear an explosive vest. And so we looked at that problem pretty hard in the early fall of 2019. And we had a couple of options. We could have struck him from a drone, but we could never come up with an elegant enough solution where we could avoid killing children and people around him. And so we looked at that very hard. And I was not willing to go with that option. And there was also a more pragmatic option. You strike a guy from the sky in the middle of nowhere, it's hard to prove you actually got him. The myth can live on if you can't give definitive DNA evidence that this is our guy and we got him. So we looked at this, and I was talking to some of the best people in the world at solving this problem. We couldn't find that. So we looked at it, and back and forth with my Special Operations Task Force commander, we looked at another alternative. A riskier alternative, but one that would place a couple hundred Americans deep into Syria to land around the compound, to isolate the compound, to give him the opportunity to surrender, and if he didn't, to go in and capture or kill him. And of course, that's what we did. Now, it was a little harder than it sounds. I described it pretty flippantly in a couple of sentences. But we were in the fall of 2019, we were in a major argument with the Russians about a crossing of the Euphrates River down at Deir ez-Zar, which is several hundred miles away from where we're talking. But the Russians were pushing across it, and we didn't want them to do that. And so we were in a pretty aggressive stance with the Russians down there. And they control Syrian air defense. So we were worried about flying this big package, is what we'd call it in the vernacular, helicopters and other things deep behind enemy lines. Well, we were confident that our helicopters could get in. We just felt that we would be able to shield them, mask them. Nobody could see them. But we really needed to put drones up on top of the objective, MQ-9s, slow-moving, propeller-driven unmanned aircraft that do three things for you. They provide communications relay, they provide fire support if you need it, and they give us video images of what's going on the ground. They're defenseless, and if air defense wants to shoot them down, they're the easiest target in the world. So we thought, we'll tell the Russians we're coming in shortly before we go in. And we talked about it. And so General Milley drew the responsibility for talking to General Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff. And we called him about 30 minutes before we crossed the Euphrates River with the package. And Gerasimov said, well, I'm not going to let you do it. We're going to stop you. Our calculation was, he probably didn't mean it, A, and B, he would not be able to actually transmit an order down there to his guys in 30 minutes. And in fact, he did not. We went in. We were illuminated by Syrian air defense radars, but the Syrians are not particularly brave. They prefer to shoot at targets as they leave rather than as they come in, because they know if you shoot them when they come in, you're going to suck a radar-seeking missile right back at you. They know that from long experience with us and with the Israelis. So they prefer to wait till you're leaving, fire a bunch of missiles in the air, declare a massive victory. And so we were pretty confident the Syrians weren't going to shoot. So the package goes in. I'm monitoring it from my headquarters here in Tampa, talking to my mission commander who's forward in the theater, and ultimately pretty close-up view of what's going on the ground. My job as the theater commander is to allow the experts on the ground to do their job. The people that are going in are the best people in the world at this. They know how to manage the risk on the ground. They know how to take actions on the ground. And they did. We set a security cordon around the compound. We did what we'd call a call out with a colloquial Arab speaker. He did not come out. Some of his defenders, some of his security guys came out, and we removed them from the battlefield. A couple of his wives came out, and we shot them too. They were shooting at us. We shot back at them. 12 children came out, and we were able to get all the children out. We were able to get all of those 12 children out. And then he crawled in, so we continued to call for him to come out. He crawled into a hole in the ground underneath the house, blew himself up with 2 children. And this, of course, is where Conan the Wonder Dog enters the play. So Conan's down there, with a camera on his head. Not a particularly well-tempered dog, but then he had a pretty rough life, I would guess. But he went down there. We eventually discovered the remains of Baghdadi and were able to get enough out to do a definitive DNA analysis and demonstrate that it was him. Pulled everybody out, struck and destroyed the objective because I didn't want it to be in any way a monument to him. And we got the whole force out. So what's the lesson learned there? The lesson learned is about the American way of war. Given a choice, we're going to try to avoid civilian damage. Every time I tell this story, people say, well, what about the Israelis in Gaza? And here's my answer to that. It was easy for me to do this because his house was in the desert. There was nothing near it. If I'd gone into a city, it would have looked a lot more like Israeli operations in Gaza than what we were at. I was very lucky. I was able to carry this out on what was essentially a billiard table of a desert out in Western Syria. There were no people close around. And so that gave us some advantages as we actually went in on the objective. But it was a remarkable story of American capability, American ability, and American memory. You know, we were going to bring him back. Had he surrendered, we would have been happy to bring him out alive. He chose not to surrender, and in fact, of course, died a coward's death, killing 2 innocent children with him when he did it.
So you mentioned that you dismissed the idea of a drone strike. One of the problems with drone strikes, which we became very dependent on during the Obama years, is that they blow up all the pocket litter as well and all the intelligence that you get on the ground. Were you able to extract a lot of intelligence from the compound before you destroyed it? And also, with drone strikes, you blow up the target, you blow up all the intelligence in their brains along with the strike. Was there any thought to trying to take him alive and interrogate him, or are we just out of the business of interrogating people after the interrogation wars of the...
No, we would have preferred to bring him out. We were configured to bring him out. We would have preferred to bring him out. We had, colloquial Arab speakers telling him to surrender. He was wearing a suicide vest and he blew himself up. You always prefer to bring him out if you can bring him out. Sometimes you're able to do that. Sometimes you're not. We got some intelligence information off that objective. Sometimes you get a real treasure trove. Sometimes you don't. We got a little bit, not a whole lot off that particular objective. We got more than we would have gotten had we struck it from an aircraft.
Where would you have taken him if he had surrendered?
Probably back to a base where it was, I can't tell you, but back to there, and he would have been probably turned over to other national authorities from his home nation at that point. But again, that's all speculation because he chose not to do that.
Right. And I know we're not going to get out of here without talking about Soleimani, but you brought up the war that's ongoing between Hamas and Israel and between Hezbollah and Israel. It's really, I guess, the more appropriate to call it a war between Iran and Israel. And I'm interested in your thoughts. We hear a lot of criticism of the Israelis for the way that they've been conducting this war. Obviously, there are people, Mr. Spencer from West Point and others, who have disagreed with that. This is your world, this is your AOR, and these are people who you know. What is your assessment of the Israeli campaign so far?
Let me back up and take it at a very high level first and say what is remarkable about what's happened since October has been the lack of Iranian actual support for Hamas. Think about it. Iran has had opportunities to come into this fight. They have chosen not to. And let me be very clear. The Iranian attack on Israel of 13 April was not related to what's going on in Gaza. That was directly related to the fact that the Iranians have been consistently outfought by the Israelis in the proxy war they fight against each other around the region for a couple of years, culminating in the 1 April strike against IRGC, Islamic Republican Guard planners up in Damascus. Iran thought they had to fight back at Israel in a major red line crossing attack in order to try to reset the terms of the engagement with Israel. In no way was it in support of Hamas, although they applaud what Hamas is doing. Let me be clear. They're just not providing any direct support for it. That attack failed. And Iran has had to recalculate as a result of that. So that's an important thing to know and understand. The other thing that's important to know and understand, at least up until about now, Hezbollah has not been particularly aggressive in their support of Hamas. Now, look, easy for me to say that. I know there's probably 80,000 Israeli citizens that have come south from the northern tier of kibbutzes and cities that can't be in their homes now. But if LH came into the fight, unlike Iran, who's for a lot of reasons, their options to attack Israel are limited, LH has vast opportunities to attack Israel and cause great pain and damage. Over 100,000 weapons, tens of thousands of which can reach metropolitan Israel. LH can go in. LH has chosen not to do that, again, because while they applaud what's going on with Hamas, they're not ready to come in. Hassan Nasrallah won't come in to fight Israel, in my judgment, unless he thinks there's the possibility for a strategic victory. And LH, Lebanese Hezbollah, will not be pushed into a war with Israel by Iran. It will not happen. They'll make an independent decision. And so You'll know if they come in heavy because you'll be seeing hundreds of missiles going after Israeli metropolitan areas. The Israelis will be able to defend against most of those, possibly not all of them. But also Hassan Nasrallah knows if he comes in, the Israelis have had tanks in Beirut before. They're capable of doing that again if they choose to do it. So he knows the pain they can inflict on him. And finally, when you talk about LH, Lebanese Hezbollah, their situation in Lebanon is, in my judgment, weaker than it's been in a long time. This is because the Lebanese economy is in the tank. 99.9% of the population are living hand to mouth. LH bears some responsibility for that. Additionally, the Lebanese government can't get itself seated, because of the bizarre confessional nature of the government. The prime minister, the president, and the speaker of the House have to be from different sects, different religious groups. They can't seat that. LH bears some responsibility for that, and people in Beirut in particular still remember the Beirut port explosion, which LH didn't set off, but their negligence contributed to it. So his position is weaker, and he will have to take all those things into account before he decides to strike Israel. So finally, the guys that are really energized about this are actually the Houthis down in Yemen. They are the most radical of the people we're talking about. They actually do support Hamas and have tried very hard to go after Israel. Their options to go after Israel are limited, A, by geography, B, by shot count. They can't generate enough fire to overwhelm Israeli defenses. But what they can do is close the Bab el-Mandeb, which means closing the Suez Canal, except probably to Chinese shipping. And so they've chosen to do that. And as a result, the world's economic system is under stress. We, the United States, have said we're going to reopen it, not necessarily because of any support for Israel, but because we as a maritime nation understand the impact of free access to the global commons. We have been unable to do that. My judgment would be that we have the military capability to do that. We have not demonstrated the political will to do that. Again, let me be real clear. The capability is there. The political will to execute that task and to make the Houthis stop doing what they're doing, nobody's willing to make that ultimate decision. So that's sort of the big picture. And the last thing I'll say about Iran is this before we go on. To understand what the Iranians are doing, you need to understand what the highest priority of Iranian statecraft is. And the number one priority is preservation of the regime. They view themselves as a revolutionary regime, and the first task of any revolutionary regime is to stay in power, export the revolution, pass it on to the next generation. So the Iranians will always default to objective number one. Now, objective number two is destruction of the state of Israel. Objective number three is ejection of the United States from the region. Sometimes 2 and 3 flip, depending on the day of the week and the Iranians' mood. Nothing ever challenges one. And the Iranians are actually very rational, calculating actors within this model of state behavior. And I'll pause there.
So I don't want to let you off the hook with Gaza, but I want to ask you a question because it's something that I've been wondering about. Back in July, General Kurilla, who has the position that you had as the commandant of Central Command, which encompasses all of the Middle East and some other cats and dogs, not actually cats and dogs, they're pretty important, wrote a letter to the Secretary of Defense, in effect complaining about the Yemen campaign, complaining about not taking on the Houthis. And I'm not a military person, I'm a Middle East person. How usual is that? And why is it that you think, and this is a political question, but you're no longer in uniform, so I'm going to ask you anyway, why is it they don't have the will to go after it? So Kurilla and Will.
Sure. So let me begin with General Kurilla's letter, which we did. I know General Kurilla. He was my chief of staff my first year in command at CENTCOM. He's a great commander, superb commander. When commanders write letters like that, they just want to be on the record with their position. I wrote a lot of letters like that. Nothing concentrates people's mind like a signed letter from a 4-star combatant commander. I'm sure General Kurilla actually regrets that it was leaked. I'm confident he did not leak it, and CENTCOM didn't leak it. But, as you know, once it gets into the D.C. mix, things are leaked for all kinds of reasons, political and otherwise. But I think he just wanted to say, look, we're in a situation where, in my observation, without knowing any of the classified details here, is you've got a situation in the Red Sea where U.S. Navy warships are playing catch. Warships are not meant to play catch. Warships are meant to pitch. You got an aircraft carrier down there that's playing catch. Aircraft carriers are not meant to play catch. They're meant to pitch. The U.S. Navy is an offensive weapon, and it needs to be employed offensively. Now, look, military power is a blunt, bloody, sometimes indiscreet instrument, but it can bring results if you're willing to make the decision to employ it. There are 2 ways to make the Houthis stop. One way is you inflict enough pain so they stop. They don't want to continue. Well, that might or might not work with people that are so motivated. The second thing is you remove their capability to take these actions. That means you go after the missile, where they build the missiles, where they store the missiles, where they launch the missiles, their radar surveillance sites. You go after ships at sea that might be passing information to them, and you go after Houthi leadership. Both those military options are within our capability. All it requires is the political will to actually execute those operations.
So I want to take you back to the Soleimani strike, because you were talking about how objective number one for the regime is survival. And one of the previous administration set a pretty clear red line for the Iranians that if you kill an American, we're not going to hold your proxies responsible. We're going to hold you responsible. And when they crossed that red line, you guys took out Qasem Soleimani. First of all, take us into that operation and the decision making there, and how that helped reestablish deterrence in the region.
And actually, as you answer that, you wrote a great piece in The Atlantic just earlier this year in which you said the headline says it all. I carried out the strike that killed Soleimani. America doesn't understand the lesson of his death. So that'd be a great part of the answer to Mark as well.
So I'll begin by saying here's the lesson of the strike on Soleimani. The Iranians will respond if you threaten them directly. We go back to objective one. Qasem Soleimani was a unique figure in the Iranian government. He was in the Republican Guards, and he commanded the Quds Force, the elite within the elite. He had a familial relationship with the supreme leader. He really could go directly to the boss, the ultimate boss, around the entire Iranian military chain of command, and he did it whenever he wanted a project advanced and he was getting friction from inside the military. He was unique. And he was in the blood on his hands. There's a lot of American blood on his hands. Going back towards the end of our time in Iraq, actually, nobody was more responsible than Soleimani for introducing explosively formed penetrators, or EFPs, that killed a lot of American soldiers and Marines in the latter part of our operations there. He's directly responsible for that. The decision to strike Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 was because he was entering Iraq with plans to carry out significant future attacks on our embassy in Baghdad and on other U.S. allied and friendly states in the region. So the decision to strike him was a tactical decision designed to prevent further loss of life. But at the same time, of course, you balance the strategic side of it. You know the long-term effect, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But the argument was, and I agree with this argument completely, the risk of inaction was greater than the risk of action. And as I talk to you here today, some years after that, I am confident that more people are alive today because he died than would have been the case had he been allowed to continue. And I would refer to one other, an external source. Then Foreign Minister Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, made the mistake of recording an oral history, which of course leaked. It appeared in the New York Times, but he talked about the significance of the strike on Soleimani, how much it set them back. And that's worth reading independently just to see what the Iranians, they thought about that strike. So the Iranians know and understand the use of force. They respected the use of force. Their response a week later was to strike us at Al-Assad. And they were intending to kill Americans there, but it was still designed by then to be a scoped attack. Because of great action by commanders on the ground, we were able to avoid lethalities in that strike. A number of Americans did receive traumatic brain injury because it's the first time really Americans had been hit by ballistic missiles with large warheads. Sort of a new era in warfare that we're seeing more and more of, use of ballistic missiles. It hadn't happened to United States forces before. Because of that, because we were able to actually help the Iranians there by not causing loss of life, they backed away. They were finished. And what you saw was a form of deterrence reestablished. The problem is this: deterrence in the region is always short term. It has a very short half-life, and it must systematically be reasserted if you expect the Iranians to respect it. And that goes back to roll the tape forward to what happened in April. The Iranians were attempting to reset deterrence. They failed. The Iranians are a little shakier than they've been in some while because of the failure of that attack. And I would also add the Israeli response was very well thought out. But several days later, I was concerned they were going to go downtown Tehran, knock out 7 or 8 city blocks, kill a bunch of people, and that would have put pressure on this administration and would have put pressure on the Arab neighbors. Instead, they went in and operated in the Tehran-Esfahan corridor brilliantly. They demonstrated clear technological superiority. They struck very limited targets, and they befuddled the Iranians. The Iranians are still trying to figure out exactly what happened in that Israeli response. They did not push their neighbors away. They did not push this administration away. It was a singularly deft response to that attack. And so that's the nature of deterrence in the region. The final point I would make is this. If you want to talk about deterrence in the Middle East, the first words out of your mouth can't be, our objective is to de-escalate. Because if your objective is to de-escalate, well, you need to leave. That's the natural, logical end to that policy. No one wants uncontrolled escalation. No one's talking about that. But the end of your policy can't be that particular thing. We may all wish to prefer that escalation not happen, but you have to be willing to accept some possibility of escalation if you want to be relevant, credible, and have a deterring effect in the Middle East.
So to follow up on that, after the Soleimani strike, President Trump tweeted out that he had selected 52 targets in honor of the 52 American hostages, and that if Iran retaliated and killed an American, he would strike those. And I'm told on good authority that he also sent signals through the British and Swiss channels that if they killed another American, he would kill the Ayatollah Khamenei. Is that your recollection, number one? And two, you started by saying that combatant commanders answer to civilian authorities. You worked with President Trump. I don't want to get you into politics, but I want to talk about foreign policy. He ordered the Baghdadi strike, which was a very high-risk operation. He ordered the Soleimani strike, which was a very high-risk operation. He ordered the operation that reduced the caliphate to, as you said, a very small area. What was he like to work with as a commander-in-chief, from your perspective as a combatant commander?
I had the opportunity to brief him on those operations. He was engaged. I was always in there, for a very specific set of questions that I needed answered, and I stayed on task. My job wasn't to monitor the political discussions in the room, the atmospherics in the room, but I was there to get decisions, and typically I got those decisions, from him, and they were very clear. In the cases that you discussed, they were very clear. In my experience, he made those decisions, which I agree with you. Those were the correct decisions. Decisions that, had they not been made, would have resulted in ultimately greater loss of life for the United States.
How about on the message to the Iranians?
I have no knowledge of that. No knowledge, and I might not have knowledge of it. There's no reason. That would not have gone through military channels, so I have no knowledge of that.
Got it.
So one really problematic issue for us on this, understanding the lesson of killing Qasem Soleimani, is that not long thereafter, we followed with I think there's large agreement that the withdrawal itself from Afghanistan was a debacle. There are people who disagree about the wisdom of it. Mark and I certainly disagreed with that decision and disagreed with Donald Trump's decision to encourage it when he was president. How do you think that factors into how the United States is viewed in the region in terms of our decisiveness and our willingness to take on these sorts of challenges?
From Afghanistan is viewed as a sign of weakness in the region and globally. I think it directly contributed to President Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, and I think the Chinese probably drew strength from it as well. That's my observation. I have a lot of other observations about the withdrawal itself, but ultimately, when it's all said and done, however it was executed, whatever the reasons for it were, we were viewed as running in the lurch and resulting in what you see happening in Afghanistan today, which of course is very disheartening for all of us.
Oh, it's a tragedy, it really is, and it's heartbreaking. So you operated. I'm asking a combo military political question here. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a political decision, not a military decision. Right now, discussions are going on, as they did under Donald Trump, I should emphasize, about what the U.S. profile should be in Iraq and whether we should withdraw the smaller number of remaining troops that we have in northern Syria. When I think about the implications of that, and when I think about that in terms of not just the bad guys who are on the ground inside Iraq, but also in terms of Al-Hol camp, which houses about 10,000 ISIS men, women, and children, I worry a great deal. Do you think, is that concern overdrawn? What is your view about our continued presence in those two places?
So, first of all, we'll start with Syria. I think there's probably an Al Hol camp. I think there's probably closer to 50,000, mainly women and children, but ISIS affiliated. Yes, ISIS affiliated. They live a subsistence level existence, but they're better off than they would be probably if they were in the camp. The problem is they're being radicalized while they're in the camp. So that's Al Hol camp. There are other smaller camps. Then there's a prison system that has about 10,000 ISIS fighters, all male, of which would characterize at least 1,000 as hardcore ISIS fighters. And that population at Al Hol survives because of our partners, the Kurds. And also the prison that 10,000 fighters are in is because of our partners that sit on that. If we left, I wouldn't, then I don't know what would happen in Al Hol. Probably not anything good, but I know what would happen in the camp, in the prison. Those fighters would be freed. That's a significant problem that would occur if we withdrew. Additionally, the fact of the matter is, ISIS still seeks to regenerate up and down the Euphrates River Valley. The U.S. isn't directly involved in this fighting. Our partners are. We enable them to fight. But the theory is this: if you're worried about surviving the night, it's hard to plan an attack against Detroit. While you may have aspirations to attack externally, if the counterterrorism pressure on you is significant, it's hard to do that. That's the theory behind why you stay in Syria. And there are other lesser effects there. It's inherent to the Iranians, and that's certainly a lesser included effect. But nonetheless, really, if you pull out, then ISIS is going to resurge. These camps are going to be overrun, and you're going to have significant human disaster problems, as well as an injection of trained fighters into the body politic. Okay, now if you stay in Syria, you got a base in Iraq. The logistics base has to come out of Iraq. So, just for a lot of reasons, that's where you support your forces in Syria. So, look, I think we're going to eventually come to some agreement with the Iraqis going forward. Today, what I read, I guess there's 2,500 or so U.S. forces in Iraq. That's probably going to get smaller over time, and it can get smaller over time. What we don't want to do is precipitously draw down, as we did disastrously with the Obama administration, which led directly to the rise of ISIS in the situation that we have there right now. Look, no one knows better than me the many multifarious problems with the Iraqi government, the penetration by Iran, the Shia groups that hold forth. But when it's all said and done, actually, they don't want us to leave. They want U.S. presence. It may be renamed something else. And as you know, the strategic dialogue process is going forward. Look, we can probably get a little smaller. I don't know. And I don't think we're going to go to zero, because I don't think they want us to go to zero. When we withdrew, we went to 117 people disastrously, with the Obama withdrawal. 117 people, and that was all the U.S. military presence in Iraq. I think we're going to still, whatever the future is, I think it'll be a much larger platform than that in Iraq. But the one thing that's good is I believe there is an ongoing dialogue with the Iraqi government. And while all the pro-Iranian stuff gets the headlines, there are actually other elements of that government that are supportive of the United States and NATO staying.
So I want to go back to Afghanistan for a moment, because you've testified, I have a couple questions on this. You testified that you had recommended that a residual force of about 2,500 troops. Other military commanders, I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as well, testified to the same. If we had followed that advice, if we had kept 2,500 troops, do you think that we could have held on to Bagram? Do you think that the Taliban would have come to power? And what would have happened in the withdrawal if we had listened to that advice?
Well, if we had stayed at 2,500, which was my recommendation, the recommendation of my subordinate, General Scott Miller, our four-star commander in Afghanistan until July, and General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at 2,500, it was my best judgment that the Afghans would have held on. And remember, at 2,500, NATO would have kept almost 5,000 troops in Afghanistan. So you're not just talking about 2,500 U.S., you're talking more NATO forces than U.S. forces in Afghanistan. My best judgment that the Afghans would have held on. It would have been rough. We would have held Bagram, and we would have been able to prosecute operations with our interagency partners against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So yes, I believe that to be the case. However, we also were very clear when we said this, we need to change our negotiating posture with the Taliban and be less supine and more aggressive as we talk to them. We were not very assertive with the Taliban in our negotiations from Doha forward, and that figured large in why the defeat in Afghanistan occurred. We needed to change that, and that's not a military problem. I could just give a recommendation on that. Now look, there's another side of this coin. People say, well, you couldn't stay at 2,500. We'd have had to put more forces in. That's a counterfactual. We can argue that all day. That's not my judgment. I don't believe that to be the case, but well-meaning people could have a different view on that, and I recognize this. But that will remain forever a subject for debate. What is not a subject for debate, though, is that if you go to zero, the Afghan government collapses. That's not a counterfactual. That's history. And we were very clear that that would be the outcome of going to zero.
So the Washington Post reported that the Taliban actually hadn't intended to take Kabul on April 15th, but when the government fled, there was a meeting that was arranged quickly in Doha between you and the Taliban leader Abdul Ghani Baradar. And the Post reports, at least, he said, "We have a problem," Baradar told McKenzie. "We have two options to deal with it. You, the U.S. military, take responsibility for securing Kabul, or you have to allow us to do it." He used, according to them, he said allow. And then it said the Post reported, quote, "Throughout the day, President Biden remained resolute in his decision to withdraw all American troops from Afghanistan. The collapse of the Afghan government hadn't changed his mind. So McKenzie, aware of those orders, turned down the Taliban leader's offers to let the U.S. secure the city and told him the United States needed only control of the airport so we could evacuate our citizens and our allies. Quote, on the spot, an understanding was reached according to two U.S. officials. The United States could have the airport until August 31st. The Taliban would control the city." Is that an accurate description of what happened? And did the decision to not maintain control of Kabul, was that made on the ground in your meeting, or was that from higher up in Washington?
It's not completely accurate as you outlined it. We had done a study of what it would take to control Kabul, and it would have required a reinforced U.S. division with a core slice. It would have meant putting about 30,000 additional U.S. forces in had we wanted to retake Kabul. When Mullah Baradar made the offer to me, it was off the cuff. It was nothing as formal as has been presented to you. And I knew what would happen if we had to do that. Let me give you an example. The area that we had defended would have expanded dramatically. We would have had far more opportunities to be attacked by ISIS than we actually had by settling at the airport. From a military point of view, and I had examined the problem, it wasn't new to me when he brought it up, there was no upside to doing that. I believe today, talking to you, had we actually, and again, I begin by saying it wasn't a serious offer. Second, let's assume it was a serious offer, had I taken him up on it, I don't know that Baradar actually, given his current position in the Taliban, was in a position to make that offer for the rest of the Taliban. Look where he is in the chain of command today. And second, had we gone in, our attack surface would have expanded dramatically, and ISIS would have had lots more opportunity to attack us. So no, it was not in my judgment, it was not a serious offer, and in order to accomplish it would have required a vast introduction of U.S. military capability back in, and that was not something we were prepared to do.
Well, was it that we didn't have it, or that there wasn't political will to do that? Because giving up the capital during the evacuation was catastrophic. It's the reason why, between giving up Bagram and giving up the capital, it's why those 13 Americans were killed.
I would argue once you go to zero, you give up everything. So once you go to, I actually wasn't zero, 700 U.S. forces defending the embassy and parts of Hamad Karzai International Airport. But once you go to zero, I mean, you can't hold Bagram and you can't hold the capital either. There's no possibility of that. So really, you've made decisions that have taken you to that point. Yes, we could have gone back in and we had the capability to do that. And I had an opportunity to brief that to the White House later in the day. My decision was not overturned, and it could have been overturned, but it wasn't.
I want to get to, you've really been generous with your time. I'm not going to set you up and ask my Qatar question, which I've asked you before in a different setting, because, well, I just don't think we should be in El Udeid, and I'm not going to ask that question. I'm going to ask you about Gaza. Give us your assessment as a military man, as someone who knows the region, who's worked with everybody involved, not Hamas, what you think of the war.
So the campaign in Gaza is a difficult fight for the Israelis because Hamas prepared the battle space beautifully with a combination of deep tunneling and a conscious decision to shield themselves with human beings at every phase of the fight. We talk about the Israeli hostages, but the real hostages in Gaza are the Palestinians in Gaza who are being used as shields by Hamas. That's the real larger issue that probably doesn't get enough attention. And the next point would be combat in a built-up area is the most indescribably difficult military operation that a force can undertake. Casualties are high. The sense of being in an urban fight is stunning to people that don't experience it. And you're fighting on multiple levels. You're fighting on the surface of the earth. You're fighting in the sewers, and then you're fighting in the deep tunnel system that exists there. Then you're fighting in buildings and higher buildings, and then the low airspace where the Israelis and Hamas are both flying drones. The fact of the matter is, Israelis, I would argue, have probably defeated Hamas militarily. They have not destroyed Hamas militarily. Because in a Western military, in the Marine Corps, in my service, if you lose 20% of a formation, we consider that formation no longer combat ready. Hamas is able to take much heavier casualties because they're not actually maneuvering, communicating. They're going to a position to fight to the death. So you got to really get rid of all of them there. So it makes it a very different kind of fight. Hamas is intent prolonging this fight as long as possible. They are intent on creating as many civilian casualties as possible. They are intent on creating as many dilemmas for Israeli commanders as they can. And it's just a very difficult fight. Israel has had significant success in attriting the core combat formations. There's still combat formations left. They've had some success against the military leadership. There's still some military leadership left. They've had some success against the political leadership. Sinwar is still alive. And I think that's a significant problem for Israel, frankly, just speaking very candidly to you. And so I think I don't think actually Hamas has any interest in ending this fight. They would like this fight to continue as long as possible because they see the damage that's done, to Israel and the world community, and that's a good sign. But I go back to something we said at the beginning. Remember that LH hasn't come in to support Hamas, and the Iranians have not come in to support Hamas. And other Arab nations have been fairly quiet on this as well. That's telling.
It is. It is at that. Thank you. You've been really more than generous, and this has been a great conversation. We have to do it again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all take care. Bye-bye.
So, Danny, I finally got an answer to my question, which I've been wanting since the Afghan withdrawal, which is how did that decision get made to allow the Taliban to secure Baghdad instead of the U.S. military? General McKenzie said he made it. He could have been overruled. He's right. I think that he made that decision. My guess would be is because he sensed that there wasn't the political will to provide the troops, even though we could have, as he said, provided the troops to secure the capital. But that was the most consequential decision after the decision not to keep 2,500 troops in the ground in the first place and to give up Bagram Air Base. Because if we had controlled the capital, we could have established a security perimeter between the capital and the airport. We would not have been depending on the Taliban and their terrorist allies to secure the road to the airport, and those 13 Americans would not have died. The whole responsibility for this rests in the White House. It's the most catastrophic foreign policy failure of my lifetime. But the fact that a combatant commander felt that he didn't have the support from the President of the United States to provide the troops necessary to secure the capital and have a normal evacuation, and so turned down an offer from the Taliban to allow us to control the capital, is a searing indictment of this president.
Well, we should underscore, General McKenzie said he did not believe that that was a genuine offer from the Taliban, and Mullah Baradar is not exactly, a guy who has been reposed with vast quantities of responsibility. So that is, I think, part of the story as he tells it. The problem, Mark, is this. We had the withdrawal from Afghanistan was the culmination of a disgraceful political process that took place, as so many disgraceful things take place in Qatar. The discussions that were going on with the Taliban that began under the Trump administration with Khalilzad and continued under the Biden administration were just so wrong in every single way. And you see their echo to this day, this desire to sit down with Hamas leaders, let's negotiate. Let's figure out what you're thinking. This desire to sit down with Hezbollah, let's sit down and talk about what your demands are. And it's like, I'm sorry, we know what their demands are. Their demands are you die, you leave, you die, we use our territory to plan to kill more of you. That this is what they are. The Taliban, all of these Islamists, Salafis, extremists, right? That is what their plan is. The Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of them, whether Shia or Sunni, that's what they're about. And the fact that our diplomatic and intelligence people think that it is right for us to negotiate with them is just unconscionable. This is something that I would say previous presidents would have looked at and thought, WTF. But now it's just a matter of course. We just sit down and chat with the terrorists.
I interviewed President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and he pointed out that, because the Biden administration likes to paint this as well. We just inherited this agreement from Donald Trump. Number one, they also inherited a secure border from Donald Trump, and they didn't keep his policies in place there. So I guess Afghanistan, they were their hands were tied, but at the border their hands were not. That's a BS argument. But he also points out that the Taliban were not abiding by the agreement. However bad that agreement was, they weren't abiding by the agreement, and so they weren't tied by that. He says that he would not have given up Bagram Air Base. And he said recently, he didn't say this to me, but he pointed out that it's very close to the Chinese nuclear program, that it actually had strategic value, not just in terms of the Middle East, but in terms of China. If we had listened to General McKenzie and kept 2,500 troops, we could have kept Bagram. The Taliban would not have come into power, and things would be very different. I didn't get a chance to ask President Trump this, but he says he would have kept Bagram. Does that mean you would have kept the 2,500 troops? Because he did do that.
You had asked him.
He did do that in Syria. He did do that in Iraq, despite promising to withdraw troops. He was convinced to keep troops there. I suspect he would have kept about 2,500 troops. We would have kept that base. The Taliban wouldn't have inherited tens of billions of dollars of U.S. weapons. They would not be in Kabul today. If we had kept Bagram Air Base, then the suicide bomber who carried out the Abbey Gate bombing would have still been in prison in Bagram Air Base because we had him in a prison there. And our exit handed him over to the Taliban released him, and then he went and blew it up. So that Abbey Gate bombing wouldn't have happened. The disaster that unfolded wouldn't have happened. So I think history would have been, so this was the most catastrophic, and as General McKenzie says, Ukraine wouldn't have happened, because this was direct input into President Putin's decision-making on this. This is the most catastrophic decision that any president has made on foreign policy in my lifetime. And thank God that Joe Biden is not going to be president for the next 4 years, but I worry that someone even less competent than he might.
Well, I don't know which one of them is less competent, but it's a toss-up. It's a toss-up, that's for sure. I know you know. I know you know. And I know you know. We may differ on that as well. And with that, folks, thanks for being with us. Take care.
See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.